Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
What we're dealing with here is a total lack of respect for the law.
You're listening to Done by Law, brought to you by the Federation of Community Legal Centres.
Good evening and welcome to Done by Law on 3CR 855 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital. It's just on 6:01 and you're here with Beth and Ingrid broadcasting live from the 3CR studio. We'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, custodians of the lands on which we are broadcasting and recording. Where we are, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Tonight, we look at the strengths and weaknesses of the Victorian Public Health and Wellbeing Amendment Pandemic Management Bill of 2021. After being introduced into Parliament on the 26th of October, the new laws proposed by this bill have led to recent Melbourne protests and some extreme rhetoric, including threats of harm to sitting members of Parliament associated with right-wing extremists. Members of the legal community have produced a more nuanced analysis of both the benefits of the bill and also how it can be improved. The bill's passage into law was frustrated last week, and the government passed a motion to postpone debate so that further negotiations can take place. The government has said that it must pass new legislation before the 15th of December, when the current state of emergency expires. Tonight, we're lucky to be joined by Gregory Buckhorn from Liberty Victoria, who will talk us through the bill. Liberty Victoria is a peak civil liberties organisation in Australia and has been working to defend and extend human rights and freedoms in Victoria since 1936. Its members include lawyers, policy and advocacy experts, business people, academics, community activists and students. Welcome, Greg. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And apologies, I just wanted to check the pronunciation of your surname.
Buckhorn, but Buckhorn's fine. Thank you.
No, Buckhorn is great. Look, Greg, to start with, could you give us a background to the introduction of this bill? What laws have the government been using to govern during the COVID-19 pandemic, and why is the government saying that they urgently need to pass new laws now?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful just to get, a little bit of history, and I think where that really starts is with the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, which the bill that you've mentioned seeks to amend. Now, the act that we're talking about is the law which gives the Chief Health Officer, the CHO, the power to make directions which impose restrictions on our day-to-day lives. And specifically, we're looking at Part 10 of that Act, which is the part which gives the CHO emergency powers. Now, under the Act, emergency powers they're only really available to the CHO when the Health Minister makes a state of emergency declaration. Now, the issue really with the urgency of this bill is that declarations are time limited, at least in Victoria. If I digress for a moment and talk about other jurisdictions in Australia, there are sort of time limits that apply to declarations, but there's no limit on how many extensions those jurisdictions can make for those declarations. So it's a point of difference in Victoria. Now, when we first started with COVID-19 pandemic in Australia back in March of 2020, the law as it then was allowed for a state of emergency declaration to be made for up to 6 months. Now, that law was changed specifically to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, so that a declaration could last up to 21 months. And so that's what brings us to, as you mentioned before, the 16th of December deadline that the government is talking about. So in effect, if the government can't pass this bill, there's really two readings of the law. One is that the Health Minister could make a fresh declaration, but I suppose that reading of the law is questionable. On the other reading, and I think this is the view that the government seems to accept, is that once the 21 months is up, the Health Minister will lose the ability to extend the declaration of the state of emergency, and effectively that would mean that Victoria is left without any powers to manage the pandemic. So it would be the only state in Australia where laws cannot be enforced, for example, to require people to wear masks or check in at the supermarket or to isolate if they do contract the disease. So I suppose that's really a brief history and an explanation as to the urgency surrounding the bill.
We might just have lost Greg there. I don't know. Greg, can you hear us at all?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Excellent. No stress. Now, did you hear that question? We were just asking what Liberty Victoria's view was on the existing laws in Part 10 of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, the one you just mentioned. Were there issues that needed fixing in that act?
Yeah, I think broadly Liberty Victoria's view is that the existing laws really aren't fit for purpose. Now, when we're talking about emergency powers, I think what they originally had in mind was short-term crises. So things that weren't going to last beyond maybe a couple of weeks or months. We might be thinking here, bushfires or floods or things like that. So really, the Part 10 of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act is a blunt instrument, which wasn't really designed to deal with the long-term dangers to public health that a pandemic like brought on by the COVID-19 disease has brought. So fundamentally, we have really three issues with the current law. So the first is around accountability. So at the moment, it's the Chief Health Officer who makes the pandemic orders, but the Chief Health Officer is not an elected official. And there really isn't much to the law about who the Chief Health Officer or maybe those enforcing the directions are responsible to, and how you can go about challenging decisions if you feel that you've been unjustifiably affected. The second is really around transparency. So to date, we really haven't seen much of the data or advice which justifies the restrictions. And to use, I think, a notable example, we've had curfews that we were all living under for a number of months. The commentariat was saying that the curfews were not effective in managing public health, yet we were living under a curfew. So there wasn't any requirement for that advice to be published. And so that, I think, is a second issue around transparency of decision making. And then I think thirdly, from a human rights perspective, there really wasn't an emphasis in the law on human rights being a central feature of any decisions that are made. So I think we can all really agree. We've just come out of a pretty lengthy lockdown, and I think lockdown number 6, and those lockdowns involved significant restrictions on our day-to-day lives. So our ability to move to and from our homes, ability to see friends and family and to gather and associate. So really that's our third concern is around human rights being central to any decision making. And there I think that I guess that's the flavour of our concerns with the law as it stands at the moment.
And Greg, what are some of the improvements to transparency and accountability contained within the proposed new laws?
Yeah, so I think broadly speaking, Liberty Victoria is of the view that the bill is an improvement on the current state of the law. I mean, assuming the bill can get passed. When we're talking about accountability, I think some of the main improvements, and this I think has garnered a bit of media attention, but the first is that there's a change from the Health Minister making a declaration of a state of emergency and giving that power to the Premier. Now, I think there's been some suggestion that this is a power grab, but I think from our perspective, what it's doing is moving responsibility for a very significant decision from, I suppose, an ordinary member of Cabinet, the Health Minister, to the highest level of government of the day, the Premier. So really, that's the highest level of accountability. And if there is an issue, then it's the highest level of government who has to be responsible for that considerable decision. So I guess that's, for us, the first improvement in accountability. And the second is, once a declaration is made, that's what gives the Chief Health Officer the power to make pandemic orders. That'll change, and the power will move to the Health Minister. So in this sense, it's moving the power to make orders to which restrict our day-to-day lives from an unelected bureaucrat to an elected official. So in both cases, with the Premier and the Health Officer, we have elected officials who are making these significant decisions, and at the end of the day, if the public's dissatisfied with those decisions, then they can vote with their feet at the ballot box. So I guess that's, I think, an improvement that the bill would introduce. We don't see it as a power grab. I think we see it as an improvement on the way in which declarations and orders can be made. And I suppose that the second aspect to this is the current law around making a declaration is only that the Minister considers the advice of the CHO and the Emergency Management Commissioner. And in the new bill that would come in, there are more tests that the Premier needs to be satisfied of before they can do that. So again, that's another level of accountability, and I suppose restrictions on the powers that the Premier and Health Minister would have. And then in terms of, I think, the second aspect of your question, which was around transparency of decision-making, well, the bill introduces a number of reporting obligations on the Health Minister and, I suppose, his delegates, so the Department of Health and authorised officers, so those who are going out and enforcing these pandemic orders. There are time limits in which these reports have to be published, and so they have to be published on a dedicated website. They have to be tabled in Parliament within, I think it's 5 or 6 days. I might have that wrong, so excuse me if I do, but it's within a number of days. And importantly, I think from a human rights perspective, those reports must include publication of how the Minister has considered human rights and their justification for any limitation on those rights. So in effect, it's a statement of reasons. If they're saying that we're going to introduce restrictions on your freedoms or your rights, then this will be the reason why the government thinks that's necessary, and we don't have that at the moment. So I think that's a fundamental improvement that the bill would bring in. Some of the other improvements in relation to transparency includes the ability of the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulation Committee, or SARC, to review pandemic orders. So they would be given the information, the advice that the Health Minister is relying on when making these orders. And ultimately, at the end of that review process, they can prepare a report for Parliament, and in that report they can make a recommendation if they're not satisfied with the orders, for the orders to be disallowed. So it could be cancelled by Parliament. I suppose that's one area where there could be some improvement, but I think the fact that there will be that mechanism if the bill's introduced, I think is an improvement on the present laws.
Thanks so much, Greg, and apologies, my daughter's just also commenting on the new laws. You just mentioned, obviously there might be some improvements to the SARC review process. Did you want to talk us through what improvements there could be to these new laws, so how they might remain a bit contentious and how they could be better?
I think I might, before I touch on SARC, I think one thing that I'd really like to emphasise in terms of what Liberty would like to see is sort of comes back to what I said about human rights being central to decision making. Now, what the bill presently is suggesting is that human rights would become a feature of decision making under the new part of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. What Liberty Victoria would like to see is that human rights become central to all decision making under that Public Health and Wellbeing Act. So we're not just talking about the new part, we're talking about the existing part and other parts which might have an impact on human rights as well. Because at the end of the day, with this new law, if it were to pass, if the threshold to make a pandemic declaration isn't met because, for example, there is no pandemic disease, the government could, in theory, make another declaration for a state of emergency. And if the bill doesn't provide for protection of human rights across the board, then we're really just left with the same, I think, unsatisfactory state of the law where human rights aren't central. So I think that's a key improvement that we would like to see, not just in the part that's being introduced, but across the board. But some of the other improvements, I think, around transparency and accountability. So I mentioned SARC before. Now, what SARC would be able to do, and there've been some amendments to the bill that have been put forward as well, but it would enable SARC to review a pandemic order, and they can make a report to Parliament for disallowance. Now, I suppose there's some uncertainty around if a minority report suggests or recommends a disallowance, whether that allows Parliament to debate the disallowance motion. So we would like to see that really clear, that it doesn't need to be a majority of SARC because as it stands, the majority of SARC is government controlled. So if the crossbenchers and oppositions believe that a pandemic order is a breach of human rights, for example, and that's one of the bases on which the disallowance can be moved, then if the government disagrees, then Parliament arguably may not have the power to disallow that order. So that's something we would like to see change. The bill also, whilst it allows for this disallowance of orders, the disallowance can only take place if both houses of Parliament agree. And clearly, the government of the day will control one house of Parliament, maybe not the upper house, but certainly the lower house. So it then becomes a bit of a blockade if the government is set on keeping these orders in place. Effectively, it's not really an accountability measure. So what we would like to see changed is it move from both houses of Parliament disallowing the order to one house of Parliament disallowing the order. And I think a really key change that we would like to see as well is presently, and particularly in relation to detention, there are only very limited ways in which a person can seek for that detention to be reviewed. If, for example, you're forced into isolation or quarantine. Now, the current law and the bill will, in effect, replicate this, provide for what's called a detention review officer, and that person can review the detention. But in effect, the process is a bit circular. You start with an order from the chief health officer. it may be reviewed by a detention review officer, but the final call is made by the Chief Health Officer. So for us, that lacks the necessary independence and impartiality that an effective review process should entail. So what we would like to see is, will there to be an external review process available, particularly in relation to detention orders, but any kind of order that has a significant impact on human rights. For example, if you're locked out of the state and you need to come back to look after family, there should be a mechanism outside of sending a letter or contacting the department for you to have that kind of a decision challenged. And we think that a body like VCAT might be an appropriate forum for that. So they're just some of the ideas that we think that could be improved. If listeners are interested, Liberty Victoria's put a comment out, and we set out what we think the improvements to the bill could be. And so I've only touched on a couple, but if they're interested in reading some of the other ones, then they can certainly do that on our website.
Thank you, Greg. And I'd really encourage our listeners to read that comment, which is very nuanced and informative and provides a really good basis for consideration of the nuance of some of these issues. Greg, we're going to play a track now, and we're going to come back to discuss some of these issues in more detail. We've chosen Anna Smirk's Human Condition. Good evening and welcome back to Done by Law on 3CR 855 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital. It's now 6:24 PM and you're here with Ingrid and Beth, and we're talking to Greg Buckhorn about the strengths and weaknesses of the Victorian Public Health and Wellbeing Amendment Pandemic Management Bill 2021. We just had a track that was Anna Smirk, Human Condition. And Greg, we have a few more questions for you on this very interesting and vital topic for Victorians.
Yes, fire away.
Thanks, Greg. And we just wanted to ask to start with, I know there were some amendments negotiated last week following initial negotiations between the government and the crossbench. Just for our listeners, could you just give us a quick overview of what's changed really recently with the bill?
So I suppose reading the amendments that are published is a bit sort of harsh. You sort of need to be comparing things, but some of the key changes that have been made, I think, improve the protection of human rights in particular. So the first, theme of changes is that the amendments seek to clarify that pandemic orders that are made, both the decisions to make an order, but also the actions that might be taken underneath an order are subject to the Charter. So public authority under the Charter, as it's defined, must act compatibly with human rights when taking an action, and when making a decision, must make that decision compatibly with human rights. Now, those rights can be limited if certain criteria are met, but fundamentally the starting position is that the public authority has to do things compatibly with human rights. So the bill, the amendments to the bill clarify that that's in fact the case. So the Health Minister, the Premier, the authorised officers, the Chief Health Officer, all of those bodies are public authorities when exercising functions under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. So that's really, I suppose, the first theme of change. There's a few provisions of the bill that are changed really to affect that, but that's sort of the broad theme. Another important theme is that, as I mentioned before, the bill will introduce tests for the Premier and the Health Minister when deciding whether to make or extend pandemic declaration in the case of the Premier, or a pandemic order in the case of the Health Minister. And there seems to be strengthening of the test by requiring that the responsible minister needs to be satisfied on reasonable grounds, so that end quote, that the declaration or the order is necessary for the protection of public health. So, it's strengthening that accountability measure by ensuring that the Premier or the Minister, their state of satisfaction has to be on reasonable grounds. And another key change, which I think has been quite contentious, has been around the bill as it was originally drafted contained a provision which said that in effect, discrimination against a person on the basis of an attribute as defined under the Equal Opportunity Act was possible. Now, the government effectively removed that provision and has clarified that a pandemic order may differentiate between persons or classes of persons, for example, on the basis of their vaccination status, or if they're of a particular age. An order can differentiate between people so that it may be that certain classes are restricted from doing certain things, or other classes of people are provided with additional levels of protection. So that's what the bill change is doing, and to remove any uncertainty about how that provision operates. Another, I think, a key improvement is the reduction in penalties. So fines that I think we've seen in the media, and those who've been following the news would know that they can be quite significant, thousands of dollars. The bill initially had the maximum fines at very high levels, in the tens of thousands of dollars, and the government revised that and effectively halved the maximum. So that's I think, an improvement. Of course, there's been no change to the ability to imprison a person, as that's what the bill would introduce under a new aggravated offence for breaching pandemic orders. Liberty Victoria is of the view that there should not be an aggravated offence. The response to a pandemic should be health-based, and I think we've seen over time the issues that if there's a particular focus on policing to enforce restrictions, that creates issues. So in our view, any response should have public health as a priority. And in doing so, it just seems unnecessary for there to be any ability to send somebody to jail for breaching a pandemic order. So thanks. I think there's some of the changes that the recent amendments are making to the bill, but I guess the conversation continues at the moment, so there may be hopefully further improvements in Liberty's view.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Greg. And I note that you said that people who are interested to read Liberty Victoria's current comment in full can head to your website. We've also put that up on our social media pages for people to refer to. And I'm sure, again, that things will change, and I'm sure any updates to Liberty's position or additional suggestions will also be on your website. Would that be right?
Yeah, so Liberty's still got its ear to the ground. We're continuing to engage with members of Parliament as best we can to communicate our views on social media and through media releases. So, if listeners head to our website, they can keep up to date with, I suppose, the work that we're doing in this space.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. You've been listening to Done by Law on 3CR 855 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital. We've been speaking with Gregory Buckhorn from Liberty Victoria about the current state of Victoria's pandemic bill. Stay tuned for Voices of West Papua coming up next.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.